Okay, let's see here. So welcome to Conversations in Digital Scholarship with Clarissa Ceglio. We had some audio problems, so we're starting a little bit late. Thanks for your patience. And I'm the creative here at University of Connecticut Libraries, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this talk. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Clarissa Ceglio, who holds a PhD in American Studies from Brown University and is a Digital Humanities Research Assistant with the University of Connecticut's Digital Media and Design Department. There, along with her colleagues, she collaborates with museums, libraries, archives, and communities on public humanities projects that engage diverse audiences. Her research focuses primarily on U.S. cultural history, with complementary emphases in material and visual cultural studies. Much of her work to date explores the processes through which artifacts acquire and communicate meaning, and thereby participate in the social construction of race, gender, citizenship, and other fluid categories of identity. She is also interested in the cultural work and history of museums, and in her current book project, A Cultural Arsenal for Democracy, The War Work of U.S. Museums, 1939 to 1946, she examines the ways in which museum exhibitions contributed to the construction of idealized forms of national, hemispheric, and international citizenship during the World War II era. Today, Clarissa will give a talk entitled Teaching Collaborations, Public History with WordPress. Please join me in welcoming Clarissa Ceglio.
Well, thank you all for your patience and also contributing at the beginning of this discussion a sense of what interest brought you here today and what you're working on. As I said, it's truly incorrect to be standing up and talking as one person about collaborative projects, so I'm glad that many of my collaborators are in the room and are represented in the work that I'm going to show you. In thinking about today's topic, teaching collaborations, I'm thinking through this as someone who embraces self-reflective learning, teaching, and practice, and so this has been a good opportunity for me to reflect on what I have learned through the various collaborations in the digital humanities, most of which I'm presenting you today revolve around the WordPress platform. So I'm not, although I can in the question and answer, talk about WordPress and the technological reasons why we chose this as our content management system for the ConnecticutHistory.org project. I won't address that unless you have questions. I'm really looking at it as a place that has facilitated a wide range of offline collaborations, if you will, that bear fruit in the online space. And by the end of this talk, I will have shared with you 3 key things that I've learned. I've learned much more than that, but I think 3 will be enough for today. I was fortunate to be a part of the ConnecticutHistory.org project beginning in November of 2011. It began at Connecticut Humanities, the state affiliate of the National Humanities, and the collaboration was initially with the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, and when Tom Scheinfeld and I moved here to UConn, the collaboration came along with us, and we have now fully transitioned the project into the hands of Connecticut Humanities, and our colleagues here at UConn Libraries are also providing technological support. So there are many people who, during my tenure on the project, need to be acknowledged, the staff and the leadership that contributed to what we will be seeing today. To give you a little bit of background, ConnecticutHistory.org is an award-winning digital reimagining of the traditional state encyclopedia that takes into account the ways in which information seekers use the internet, not only for topic-specific searches, but also for serendipitous discovery and through Facebook, Twitter, and other social media for sharing. Connecticut Humanities, as I mentioned, developed this online resource in partnership with the Center for History and New Media, and then with us at the Digital Media Center within UConn's Digital Media and Design Department. It's been built using WordPress, which I'm sure as many of you know is a free open source content management system that, although it started out for the reasons that many of you identified as a personal space to blog, has truly developed into a more robust publishing platform that ongoing entities dedicated to publication utilize now in a professional capacity. Since its debut in 2012, ConnecticutHistory.org has been adding new material on a weekly basis. And it's grown to encompass more than 1,300 entries, a little over 3,700 bibliographic records, more than 2,800 connections to digitized primary sources online residing in the museums, libraries, archives, and digital repositories that have any content in their collection related to Connecticut history. And to tell you a little bit about this, it was mentioned the interest in the narrative-driven presentation of history. That truly is at the heart of what Connecticut history is all about. We have different types of content, from the short, fun, who knew, quirky history tidbits to more substantive articles on contentious issues authored by contributors such as Walt Woodward, our state historian, and a variety of scholars working not only in universities, but again in the libraries, museums, and archives, such as Laura Smith here from the UConn Libraries, who has contributed several articles to the publication. In addition to publishing new content weekly, the model is one of collaboration and aggregation. When the project first started out, it was that rather traditional model of seeking out a qualified author, contracting that author to write on a specific topic. But as budgets around the humanities dried up, and as we looked at having a more nimble publishing model that allowed us to take advantage of good quality content that resided elsewhere, particularly on the sites of the community that the web site is there to support. So, for example, the mission of Connecticut Humanities is not to become a publishing entity. Its mission is to support the scholarship and dissemination of the scholarship of the libraries, museums, and archives in the state of Connecticut. And so becoming a content aggregator that becomes a second home for this quality content, and then through the linking to primary sources and such as the repositories, but also thinking of the physical site, the museum, the library, as a source itself that can be visited. By linking back to these sources, we are hoping for our visitors to come, explore, learn, and part of that exploration is to go back out to the content keepers, interpreters, and presenters. And as I've gone through, these are the key aspects of the website where the new content is refreshed on a daily basis. In terms of aggregating, we have a Connecticut Live feed where we pull from the Connecticut Historical Society's ongoing blog. The Florence Griswold Museum has a similar blog. Any news articles that are history-related, contemporary events. CT Live is where one can keep their finger on the pulse of what is going on in the broader world around the topic of any facet of Connecticut history. As I mentioned, collaboration has become the lifeblood of this as a publication, both in terms of supporting Connecticut Humanities mission and in terms of populating the encyclopedia rather than the on-the-shelf model where one commissions the definitive article on Harriet Beecher Stowe by the preeminent author. It is drafted, it is put out on the internet shelf, we are done, and we move along to the next topic. Rather than wait until the encyclopedia was all together, we are constantly publishing on new topics and to help illuminate for our audience the ways in which history is an ongoing dialogue and discovery and process, able to, on a single topic, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, constantly add new facets, new perspectives that are in conversation with one another, looking at perhaps alternate views as well as lesser known material or what may be to the classic encyclopedia entry tangential and not important to include, but now as an article in its own right creates a much more multifaceted view of a particular person, topic, or town. Among the collaborations that we've engaged with is teaching, and that is what I want to focus on today, is using this WordPress platform, using ConnecticutHistory.org as a hub for teaching activity. Jack Doherty at Trinity College approached us about working with his students, and fortunately for us, Jack has edited and worked with other authors to literally write the book on how one goes about writing history on the web in the digital age, and also a new forthcoming publication that is available already online about web writing for liberal arts teaching and learning. And if you're interested, there is a chapter there that goes into more detail about this collaboration. But the success of our work together led my colleagues and I into a broader stream of teaching collaborations around the state. But I will focus today on our work with Jack. For 2 years running, I've had the good fortune to collaborate with Jack Doherty at Trinity and his students on a series of entries that deal in an interdisciplinary fashion with the history, sociology, and policy of education, housing, and civil rights in the Hartford region during the 20th century. The benefit to ConnecticutHistory.org is that we did not have any coverage of housing discrimination, of the kinds of racial discriminations taking place within education, particularly as we get into the 1950s forward. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for us to acquire content that we otherwise would probably not be able to publish anytime soon. For Jack's students, it was a way to know that their work was going to see eyes beyond that of their professor, and that their work would be doing an important service to making more individuals aware of what, by and large, we might call hidden histories once one is outside of the academic circles. Initially, Jack and I thought a 500 to 600 word essay. Jack's students worked in WordPress. We take advantage of collaborative spaces such as Google Docs. So in terms of teaching students to be collaborative, the beauty of web writing is that it truly does allow for the creation and use of collaborative spaces. So students, given the criteria of length, using images not simply as illustrations, but as evidence to support their written material, began their drafting in Google Doc, where their colleagues and myself and their professor gave strategic comments on their work in progress. And from this platform, those students who wish to continue refining their work for publication in Connecticut history so that it met our additional standards for readership, then worked along with me so that they could have these published. And what I'd like to do at this juncture is to share with you, as soon as I locate it. There we go. Can I turn on the audio now? So in addition to collaboration tools that facilitated my ability not being in Hartford on Trinity campus, other than one visit I made to introduce his students to the assignment, the rest of the work was all taking place with none of us in the same physical location by and large. So that was definitely an advantage of having the collaborative tools. But in terms of how this collaboration helped students think about writing as a process, as well as history as an ongoing process of creation, I think I would like to let them, and Jack will introduce us to this.
Clarissa, can you unmute your volume on your laptop?
Is this for a second?
Authentic writing assignment than what they usually have. Here's how they explain the process.
I definitely before this took editing my writing as like very overwhelming, and I just didn't like, after I turned the paper I was like, oh, I just don't want to deal with it anymore. But then after like I got these comments back, I was at first very overwhelmed, like oh my gosh, I have so much edits to do. But going through the editing process, I actually like really enjoyed polishing my work and actually being like very happy with an essay that I like can finish. And I think that like helps me in the future because I can actually tackle a project and finish it all the way to the end instead of just dismissing it after I kind of have an okay job done.
I personally struggled with writing coming into college, and to know that now I'm a sophomore, and writing is a never-ending process, and I've learned that. But to know along the way, I learned so much about the process. I'm very happy, and this project has allowed me to be comfortable with my writing skills that I've learned thus far, and also look to the future for future publications. I've always wanted to be a published writer, and I had my first start through Connecticut history, and I look forward to meeting more in the future.
I also think the experience was very validating, at least for me. I really struggled with writing, and that's what I was really working on in this class, particularly. I mostly take science classes and do very like objective lab reports that don't require you to have any like prose or like information like in any set like way of like writing my own writing style. So I felt like incredibly supported by everybody in the project, and also like I've reached a point of like growth with my writing. I feel a little more secure to like send writing in to be published with through other venues and reach out in that aspect and in that part of the academics that I hadn't really explored before.
I really thought you felt more like a contributor and like a colleague rather than just a student hitting an assignment. Like we felt like we were working with people rather than for them to do like a paper and handing it in. Like that was really nice, and kind of felt really like respected in a sense, not being like, oh, this is like another article that I have to read, or like another essay that like a professor has to just grade and whatnot, just give you a grade back. It's like you got really constructive feedback and whatnot, and really knew you're kind of like making a difference in a sense.
I think frequently as students we spend a huge amount of time on our work to produce quality work that then doesn't get read by anybody. And I also think that very frequently when we turn in assignments, you know, they're 1 or 2 revisions away from being amazing, but due to the fact that there's another assignment due next week, they never see the revisions that could really make them so really high quality work. So I think both the aspects of sharing and then the practice of having to, you know, continually work on writing are just 2 tremendous benefits. And I also saw all the pride that these guys had, which was a very cool thing to see and be a part of.
I think one of the best comments that came out of our post-assessment in our first year of collaboration was Nicole, who shared that another student in a completely different class with a different professor had found and cited her work in their research paper. And in addition to, I don't know that writing's a never-ending process, but I was glad that the process, at least it seemed that way on the dissertation, but each finite piece of writing does have to come to a conclusion. I can go more into the mechanics of how we executed this in the first year, the kinds of reflection and changes we made to the assignment going forward in the second year, how my collaboration with Amherst Williams at Wesleyan College with students working in environmental history was different, similar, and what I learned from that. But the big lesson, the takeaway, is keep iterating and to experiment and to, most importantly, get feedback. We not only recorded these students as a means of obtaining feedback, but we received written feedback as well as one-on-one interviews to really understand, in addition to what their assignments and their final products told us, but what their experience as learners could tell us. I'd like to flip into a different kind of collaboration, and I'm very pleased that Graham Stinnett, who worked with my students and myself on designing this 1-week intensive introduction to digital humanities, a different set of issues. Here we were working in the first round of UConn's pre-college summer program, so the first time it's being offered to rising juniors and seniors across the United States. We had students in my class, only 1 from Connecticut, the rest came from the New England states and also New York. But the goal during this brief 1-week intensive where students spent anywhere from 3 to almost 6 hours with me, 5 days a week, and then also as part of that with Graham, was to give them a hands-on experience of creating a project using digital tools. And the topic area, which I had hoped they would find scintillating, comes from UConn Library's Joe Snow collection of punk rock. And in addition to being loud, raucous music, it was very much characterized by a do-it-yourself spirit, and also straight-edge culture, which promoted all ages concerts, alcohol-free venues. So in addition to being somewhat appropriate for the high school age, I also liked the do-it-yourself spirit of the flyers, the zines, the music, really captured something about what I wanted to communicate to these students about the possibilities of digital humanities and the ways in which they, as young scholars, can use digital tools in schools to do it themselves. The learning objectives were very classic. I wanted these students to acquire skills that would be useful to them as they went on their college journeys, and particularly with my interest in visual and material culture, I wanted them working with music, objects, texts, artwork. You saw the sneaker earlier. And I wanted them to learn to work collaboratively. As you know, there's a lot of discussion in higher education about the need to introduce students to wide ranges of collaborative work, because by and large, out in the workforce, they will not be in an ivory tower pondering great things all by themselves, just as none of us are, even though that is often the reputation of how the scholar works. And so during this week, I utilized a framework that Mills Kelly puts forth in his teaching history in the digital age, which is also, just as Jack's work is available free online. This is another publication I encourage you to look into if you're interested in this work. But condensing and not doing justice to the kind of methodology that Mills employs in a semester-long seminar, we structured this around questioning, finding, analyzing, making, and presenting. And our finding day was spent in the archives with Graham, where students had a behind-the-scenes tour. They were introduced how to operate in an archives so that it was no longer a mysterious experience. And I can tell you, based on the post-assessment feedback, this, along with being able to create a finished product within the space of a week, was truly the highlights for the students. Many of them did not know what an archives was. Many of them, if they did know, they vaguely thought it was like a library, as opposed to having some more museum-like qualities. And to a number, they all felt that one of the most valuable things they had learned that they could take into their college careers was to locate and become familiar with the archives on their campus. And so that, I think, is a testimony to the great work that Graham did introducing these students to the wonders and the joys that we all find in archives, but perhaps aren't necessarily apparent to the young student. The lesson that I learned from this week, although my students were producing material for ConnecticutHistory.org, we could not go through the usual process of handing the images and the prose off to the editorial team, because I wanted them to do the making of the online exhibit themselves. And so, not wanting them to break anything in the ConnecticutHistory.org space, we were fortunate to have a sandbox. And so as you'll see, it looks like our ConnecticutHistory.org site, but there's lots of broken links and funky things going on. But it's a safe environment in which to have my students do their work, be on the back end of WordPress, be able to flip forward and see how their work will look to the public. And so to be able to toggle back and forth between their work in progress and the finished product was one of the most useful things to having this sandbox available to us. Now, if it's a website created specifically for your class, your website can be your sandbox, because you won't be as hesitant to give students administrative access and privileges. But if you're working with an outside collaborator, the sandbox option can be very fruitful. These are still in progress, but you can see they could literally tell, is my text too long? I'm wedded to it, but when I see it online and see that it's starting to ooze down to the unreadability stage, the teacher no longer has to tell me why I need to cut my precious pearls of prose. I can see for myself that that's a necessary thing that needs to be done. So having a sandbox. The next collaboration I want to talk about is our Native Histories Initiative. And here it's an extra institutional collaboration. It's an informal conversation in which many people, in addition to those shown on the screen, have collaborated. Amy Denowden at the University of Massachusetts is the co-organizer with me. But for me, this is a lesson in being a student, a collaboration that has taught me how to learn from others, when I go into a field that is not my particular area of expertise. As you heard, I'm very interested in how visual and material culture structure notions of identity. And of course, the construction of indigenous identity in the United States of America is an area that I've read, but it is not the area in which I primarily work. And so when I came to the ConnecticutHistory.org project, I knew that we needed to do more than have the traditional Connecticut colonial founding histories that by and large have tended to say, and they brought the land from the Indians and established the town. Even in the cases where purchases did take place, as we know, there were different conceptual frameworks about what that transaction meant, its duration, its what type of contract it was, etc. So very complicated issues. So in this collaboration, it wasn't so much about teaching students as how can we reteach the public and open their eyes to the different possibilities of what Native Histories is and should be in its presentation within the context of the place now called the state of Connecticut. Going back to our goals, in our initial meetings we discussed that our approach should be holistic and look beyond the Western paradigms of Western history telling. That we needed to be mindful of entrenched models of history, particularly those that cast Native peoples as props within a course determined by Euro-American agents. We also needed to avoid the add Indians and stir approach, where a handful of token articles would be deemed a sufficient outcome, and that in truth, we really needed an awareness of indigenous history as we approached our thinking on all topics, not only those topics that in addition to being tagged women, social movements, Ledyard, were also tagged Native Americans. We needed to think more comprehensively about how indigenous history would ask us to pause and say, what are the alternative ways of periodizing this moment in history? What are the indigenous genealogies of the themes and events represented in this article? And where is the Native history in this? I don't want to suggest that we've achieved all these goals, and although I'm no longer working as a full-time staff member on the ConnecticutHistory.org project, I've been invited to continue this work with my collaborators. So what I want to show you here are some small steps of progress of something that is truly an ongoing issue. Some victories were simply to call attention to changing the mindset. Literature, as I said, reconstructing what this category meant. So for us, just the addition of from poetry and prose to orature, a term for the rich traditions of oral expression in Native American and other cultures, Connecticut boasts numerous literary talents. So again, making literature as broad an umbrella as possible so that it was not excluding indigenous perspectives as well as that of other communities for whom orature is a vital part of how history is communicated to future generations. In terms of representation, we knew to be cognizant of not selecting an image that spoke to one particular tribal affinity. And so our first pass at this was to pick a historic object that was utilized broadly up and down the East Coast. But once we began working with our collaborators, we learned things that we hadn't thought of. First of all, that this is a gendered object. As one of our collaborators said, this is a boy's toy. Where are the women? This is a weight for sinking the fishing nets. We were also called to task for why we had chosen an object to represent a people. And in discussion about the things we wanted to communicate, we ultimately settled upon this image. One of our collaborators from her personal archive shared this moment from her family's history on the reservation. And what we experienced was a little pushback. Will this communicate Native Americanness, whatever that means, to our audience? Will they be confused? But after some fruitful discussion, we decided that productive dissonance really was what we were aiming for. And if this did cause our audience to pause and say, wait, isn't this the Native Americans page? That they would be traveling in the direction that we were hoping to move them in. Things that were a little bit more difficult. Our site architecture is essentially 3 broad categories. Topics, what subject do I want to learn about if I haven't come here as a result of a search engine return? What people are associated with Connecticut history that I'd like to learn about? And as those of you who are Connecticut natives may know, and which I had to learn being a transplant, the town is much more important than the county. So in terms of spatial organization, we settled on the unit of the town. And there are 169 of them, and they do not include places like Broadbrook, where I live, which has its own zip code, but is part of the town of East Windsor. But we realized that this became... Or stores. Thank you very much. I had a ringer in the audience. Or Mystic. But we were challenged to think about the ways in which, for example, Ledyard, where the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation reservation is not synonymous with the reservation, does not and should not be construed as containing this sovereign peoples. And we did not yet come to a way to think about a spatial organization that would encompass the 5 reservations that the state of Connecticut recognizes as sovereign nations in the state. And so we've still held to this kind of uncomfortable place. And here the lesson I took away, part of the lesson is that these are issues that I will now always have first and foremost when we are at the design phase, when we're thinking about the architecture, when we're setting up the framework, and that these are the kinds of questions that are better to ask at this early stage. And this is where we ask those questions about what kinds of histories, what kinds of frameworks conceptually are guiding the infrastructure. And so the big lesson that I've taken away from this unfinished body of work is that we had a series of starting states. And I've not yet finished, and so instead of continually bemoaning the unfinished state of this project, I now prefer to think that we've gone through several starting states, and I am poised, as are my colleagues, on the next state that will follow. So having your own sandbox, realizing that you may not reach an end state and that you may always be in a position of a new starting state, and iterating are 3 of the core lessons that I have learned from this range of collaborations. I know I like to think of collaboration as seamless and mellifluous, something like these dancers, although I will propose to you that the lady to the far side there is the project manager. As you can see, she's carefully scrutinizing whether her partner is in sync or not. This is the vision of collaboration, but priorities, different values, timing, the problematics of working with students after the semester is over, but Connecticut history's work is not done. Different work styles. These are all factors that should be taken into account in the dance of collaboration. And so for me, it really is much more like diving into the mosh pit, the pose, the clash. Some of my past experiences come to mind. You may get a little bit bruised, you'll get jostled around, but at the end of the day, it's exhilarating and it is a tremendous amount of fun. Thank you very much.
Okay, so questions. Thanks for bearing with us with the audio problem at the beginning.